McDermott. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the first two campaigns of the American-Mexican War, 1846. But before we examine the combat itself, a few words concerning the background that brought the United States to war with Mexico might be in order. For several decades, the Mexican government had encouraged American immigration to their northernmost province in Mexico. And they were very successful in attracting American immigrants, offering a number of incentives to include land. At some point, there were enough Americans, the density got high enough that they decided that they were not going to allow the Mexican government continue to govern them from Mexico City, and they decided to establish their own republic. There were a number of battles that took place before that occurred. Probably one of the best known, of course, would have been the fight at the Alamo. By 1836, the Americans had succeeded in forming their own republic, Republic of Texas. And in 1845, the United States annexed the Republic of Texas, an area that Mexico continued to claim as part of its national territory. Now that period between 1836 and 1845 is an interesting period because leaders of the Republic of Texas almost immediately sought to change their republic into an American state. But they were rebuffed by members of Congress who were sure that a new state of Texas would be a pro-slavery state that would upset the balance of pro-slavery, anti-slavery states in the Union. And so they were put off for some time. But eventually, the Republic of Texas was accepted as the new 28th state of the Union. The southern border of that new state was in dispute with Mexico. They insisted that the southern border was marked by the Nueces River, whereas the United States insisted that it was farther south at the Rio Grande. President Polk offered to settle the dispute by purchasing the land, and the Mexican government refused. When Mexico rejected that proposal, President Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to occupy the disputed territory and to settle the issue by force of arms. Specifically instructed to defend against any Mexican military incursion, General Taylor's orders also implied that he had the authority to invade Mexico if that was necessary to settle the issue. General Taylor was a career Army officer, and he had distinguished himself during the War of 1812 and in several campaigns against Indian tribes. He'd come to national attention during the Second Seminole War in Florida, when the troops began calling him Old Rough and Ready. And this was a really rough society. And to distinguish him as being particularly rough and ready to apply rough solutions to problems is noteworthy. Establishing his supply base at Point Isabel on the Gulf of Mexico, which was about 20 miles northeast of present-day Brownsville, General Taylor then marched south to build Fort Texas on the Rio Grande River. On 24 April, he learned that Mexican troops had crossed the river north of his position, and he sent Captain Seth B. Thornton with 80 troopers to investigate. Captain Thornton encountered a force of 1,600 Mexican soldiers. He was quickly overwhelmed and taken prisoner. The main Mexican army, under the command of General Mariano Arista, then started crossing the Rio Grande on the 30th of April. General Arista moved north to engage General Taylor and his 2,300 American soldiers with a force of 3,700 men. The Mexican troops were sighted by General Taylor's scouts about noon on the 8th of May at a rural crossroads known as Palo, Alto. The Mexican artillery opened the battle in the early afternoon, and General Taylor initially deployed his soldiers behind his artillery batteries. Several charges by Mexican cavalry were unsuccessful in coming to grips with the Americans, and late in the day, American infantry drove back the Mexican right wing. The battle was marked by heavy exchanges of artillery that revealed the Mexicans had been supplied with unsatisfactory ammunition, while the American light artillery was brutally effective. Dubbed flying artillery, their tactics were to approach the enemy's lines at a gallop, swing the guns around, load them, and fire several rounds of canister at close range before moving quickly to a new position and setting up to fire again. Their successful employment was crucial to the outcome of the battle. As it got dark, the fighting stopped, and early the following morning, that is the 9th of May, the Mexican troops began moving south, leaving the Americans in possession of the crossroads at Palo Alto. General Arista's purpose in moving was to establish a defensive position that would better protect his men from the American artillery. General Taylor reported 15 men killed and 43 wounded, while the Mexican report listed 102 men killed, 129 wounded, and 26 missing. President Polk had wanted a small and quick war, but once hostilities opened, he decided to blockade the Mexican coast and occupy Mexico's northern provinces. The war that developed was neither small nor quick. Ulysses S. Grant felt that the war was an unfair action against a weak neighbor, and he later wrote that he believed the main goal of the advance to the Rio Grande was to start the war. He wrote, "We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. It was very doubtful whether Congress would declare war, but if Mexico should attack our troops, very few public men would have the courage to oppose it." Abraham Lincoln, then a junior member of the House of Representatives from Illinois, was a contemporary of Grant's, and he would be a critically important figure in Grant's future. Lincoln gained notoriety when he criticized the Mexican War and criticized President Polk specifically by calling it immoral, pro-slavery, and a threat to the nation's Republican values. One of Lincoln's constituents branded him the Benedict Arnold of our district. And Lincoln's career in Congress came to an end when his party would not renominate him for a second term. In fact, the war was very popular with the majority of Americans. Lieutenant Grant's description of how the battle opened is a compelling story. An army certainly outnumbering our little force was seen drawn up in line of battle just in front of a line of timber. Their bayonets and spearheads glistened in the sunlight formidably. The force was composed largely of cavalry armed with lances, and it was the spearheads of those lancers that Grant commented on. Where we were, the grass was tall, reaching nearly to the shoulders of the men. General Taylor halted the army before the head of column came in range of the artillery of the Mexicans. We then formed a line of battle facing the enemy. As I looked down that long line of armed men advancing towards a larger force, also armed, I thought what a fearful responsibility General Taylor must feel, commanding such a host and so far away from friends and any support. The Mexicans immediately opened fire on us, first with artillery and then with infantry. As we got nearer, the cannonballs commenced going through the ranks. They hurt no one, however, because they'd strike the ground long before they reached our lines and ricocheted through the tall grass so slowly that the men could see them in open ranks and let them pass through. When we got to a point where our artillery could be used with effect, a halt was called and the battle opened on both sides. Another American lieutenant recounted how his infantry battalion met a Mexican cavalry charge. The unit formed a hollow square with ranks 4 men deep, and their rifle fire kept the Mexicans from getting close enough to do any damage with their lances. And that lieutenant wrote, "The Americans held their fire until the lancers were just 50 yards away. The front of the square attacked, poured in its volley of buckshot and ball. Horses, officers, and men were brought to the ground. Many more of them reeled in their saddles, wounded. Some were thrown, and the rest in confusion galloped back to their own side of the field." I think it's interesting to think about how those infantry muskets operated. They were muzzleloaders, of course, and the soldier was issued with ammunition that was in paper cylinders, and he would tear the end of that cylinder off and pour the powder in the paper cylinder down the muzzle, and then push the paper and its contents with a ramrod down on top of the powder. The contents was a musket ball, the same caliber as the rifle barrel, but also several buckshot, smaller buckshot, were included with that musket ball, so that when he fired, there'd be a little bit of a spread. Results, of course, were devastating. And the ammunition was generally known as buck and ball, buckshot and a musket ball, buck and ball. And so ended the opening round of the American-Mexican War. The follow-on battle took place the very next day. General Arista moved his army about 5 miles when he decamped from the crossroads at Palo Alto. He placed his troops in a defensive position where the road crossed an arm of the Rio Grande's previous riverbed, so it was a dry riverbed. The site he selected was a 200-foot wide dry ravine, heavily timbered on both banks, and the Mexican army was in place and prepared their defensive positions by 10 o'clock in the morning. The location was called Resaca de la Guerrero by Mexicans and Resaca de la Palma by the Americans. And the battle, of course, goes by that name, Resaca de la Palma. By mid-afternoon, the American army, then numbering about 2,000 men, was approaching the dry river course that the Mexicans were defending. Once in position, General Taylor ordered an infantry attack down both sides of the road. The fight was disorganized and uncoordinated due to the dense brush and timber and the intense Mexican artillery fire. Unit integrity disappeared as small groups of men, led by an officer or by a sergeant, pushed through the brush with little coordination between groups. General Taylor then ordered Captain Charles May's Dragoon Squadron to capture the Mexicans' 3-gun artillery battery that was causing him the most trouble. And the Mexican battery was set up in their position and firing straight down that road. General May's exchange with Captain Randolph Wrigley, commanding an American artillery battery posted on the road, went like this. "Hello, Wrigley. Where is that battery? I'm ordered to charge it." Captain Wrigley's answer, "Hold on, Charlie, till I draw their fire, and then you'll see exactly where they are." The Mexican artillery was promptly charged and overrun, and then lost to a fierce Mexican counterattack. The fighting was desperate and hand-to-hand. The guns were finally captured, causing that part of the Mexican defense to begin falling back. At roughly the same time, an American unit on the right located a trail that allowed them to turn the Mexican army's flank. And after 2 failed Mexican counterattacks, the Americans pushed forward, forcing a wild hand-to-hand fight. And General Arista, unable to rally his troops, was forced to abandon his artillery and join their scramble across the Rio Grande River. General Taylor reported 33 men killed and 89 wounded, while General Arista claimed 515 casualties. Sick and wounded Mexican soldiers had been abandoned, and General Taylor insisted that they receive the same care as the American casualties. A prisoner exchange was accomplished as the reduced Mexican army prepared to retreat to Monterrey. It's important to note that there are 2 Monterrey, Mexicos. This particular Monterrey in northern Mexico is where General Taylor headed. The other Monterrey in California was also seized by the Americans, but not part of a military campaign. After tending to the casualties, General Taylor performed the last rites for both the Mexican and the American dead and ensured that all were buried with correct military ceremony. The American army then crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico on the 18th of May. The first action was to drive Mexican troops out of a border town, and General Taylor remained there until August, when reinforcements and additional transportation arrived with orders from the Secretary of War, William L. Marcy. The Secretary instructed General Taylor to, quote, dispose the enemy to desire and end to the war in the shortest space of time practicable. And the Secretary also suggested that capturing Monterrey should be his next objective. Short-term volunteer units began arriving to join General Taylor's army, but they showed up without sufficient equipment or any intention of accepting General Taylor's form of regular army discipline. There were numerous cases of local Mexicans suffering assaults, robbery, and worse from volunteers who simply ignored their own officers. In some cases, whole units were involved in misconduct, as when Georgia troops caused a riot, killing 3 men. Although a general order was issued threatening courts-martials and discharge for anyone caught plundering, its effect was minimal. Knowing little and caring less about camp sanitation, sickness among the volunteers was rampant. Independence Day 1846 was marked by a series of drunken and unruly celebrations in volunteer units' camps, and 2 days later the American Army, numbering 6,640 men, finally began to move on Monterrey. It took weeks for Washington to learn of the fight between Captain Thornton's 80 soldiers and the Mexican Army, that initial contact. President Polk described the incident as an invasion of American territory and requested Congress vote a declaration of war, and on the 11th of May, 1846, the Congress declared, quote, by the act of the Republic of Mexico, a state of war exists between that government and the United States. The Mexican government, learning of that declaration, themselves declared war on the United States about 3 weeks later. Again, Lieutenant Grant's description of his part in the Resaca de la Palma battle deserves a quote. A section of artillery had been captured by the cavalry, and some prisoners had been taken. The Mexicans were giving way all along the line, and many of them had no doubt left early. I at last found a clear space separating 2 water ponds. There seemed to be a few men in front, and I charged upon them with my company of infantry. There was no resistance, and we captured a Mexican colonel who had been wounded and a few of his men. Just as I was sending them to the rear, a private came from the front, bringing back one of our officers who had been badly wounded in advance. The ground had been charged over before I arrived. This left no doubt in my mind that the battle would have been won just as it was had I been there or not. an insightful comment by a company grade officer who recognized the fairly narrow portion of the battlefield that he had visibility of. Lieutenant George Meade was euphoric about the outcome of the battle. And he wrote, "They gave way in all directions and there was a total rout. We captured 8 pieces of artillery, all their pack mules, several hundred in number, and their ammunition, several hundred stands of arms, and all their baggage." Once General Taylor had policed the battlefield, he put the American Army on the march for the city of Monterey. And thus ends the opening chapters of the American War with Mexico, starting in 1846. Don't hesitate to comment. I look forward to opening a conversation concerning this war that was controversial at the time and has remained so, but that, of course, resulted in the expansion of the United States. Until then, God bless America.